5. Cabinet has approved for the 18th time the extension of the national state of disaster until the 15th of January 2022. The first state of disaster was implemented in March 2020 when South Africa was put under the harsh lockdown. With this in mind, of course, calls are continuing to mount for Cabinet to put an end to it. So what is the future of the national state of disaster? Until when will this continue? Joining us now to talk about this is Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs spokesperson Lungi Mtshali. Lungi, good evening and thank you very much for your time and the patience in joining us tonight here on In Focus. Look, it's an extension of a conversation that we had yesterday with civil society organizations, including the Association for Doctors, and we've also had a vaccine manufacturing company. Let's talk about what the IRR is saying. They're saying that the state of disaster could have been appropriate maybe in March in 2020 when it was put in place, but there have been several extensions that do not make sense. In fact, that we are at this particular point still not allowed to travel at midnight. There's a curfew in place which has not been explained. Let's listen to what they said and I want you to respond to it.
I think the decision in March 2020 to declare a state of disaster is defensible. It was a reasonable decision to make, and we at the Institute supported it at the time. But since then, at no stage have South Africans been permitted on a voluntary basis to leave their homes after midnight, as just one example of the extraordinary curtailment of our civil rights that has been implemented under this regime. When we first launched the petition and had our attorneys write to the presidency and the COGTA minister, South Africa had the lowest case and death records since the peak of the first wave. In October and November, there was clearly no disaster. And we said, you must therefore end it or explain why you're not ending it. If you then have a new variant, which was highly predictable, and you have a new wave, which was highly predictable, then you can reconsider your position and see whether or not you need to reinitiate the state of disaster. But if the question is, was it right or wrong to extend it in October and November, it was clearly wrong. Is it right now? Well, to answer that question, you have to ask whether you think lockdowns are effective. The evidence that we're seeing is that in South Africa, unfortunately, they haven't been.
All right. It's a violation of human rights, they say. There's no explanation as to, for example, why it was kept in place when the numbers were obviously very low.
Thank you, Tawa. I think I want to respond directly to that question, but safe to say that the epidemiology of this pandemic is pretty much predictable. So there was awareness that at some point we will have another resurgence of this virus globally and in South Africa. So it didn't make sense to say knowingly that we will have another outbreak to end the state of disaster, because the state of disaster allows us to be or to stay vigilant to the outbreak. So, for example, when we talk about March 2020, we had 5 cases and steadily growing up to 30. Now we have 22,000 cases. So it doesn't sort of add up that to say that it made sense to have the state of disaster in March and not in December 2021. So I think my point there is that we know that we have a global pandemic, and we can have a cluster outbreak at any time depending on how the virus moves. So our best defense is to have measures in place to sort of limit the movement of the virus. And we know that the virus only moves through us. So the only way to limit its movement is to limit the movement of people.
Right. Of course, you're correct. I mean, in March 2020, we locked when the numbers were low because we were supposed to assess the hazard and the implications thereof globally. Nobody knew what was going on. The WHO had issued a warning to say, this is a pandemic, here's where we are, take measures. Of course, we had to then lock down. 18 months, 24 months later, we now know what we're dealing with. We kind of see what international best practice is in other parts of the world as far as, for example, being finite in as far as we will lock down for 31 days. And after 31 days, that state of disaster is removed. And if you see a surge again, you lock down again. We seem to be keeping it on in perpetuity without any reasonable explanation.
I think the explanation that we have is that we know that at no point in time is the virus gone or under control, under complete control. So we as I say, we need to stay vigilant so that when it does break out again, we've got these measures already in place. And for that matter, if you look at the trend in terms of the levels of how government has implemented the levels of lockdown, whenever we've moved to a higher level or to level 4 or level 3, we've managed to contain the virus or the spread thereof. And what government has done consistently throughout this period is to keep its end of the bargain, to say, as soon as we have the numbers at a manageable level, we will reduce. So it's always a trade-off that we have to take in terms of the extent to which we limit the South Africans' civil rights in terms of movement. It always correlates with how the virus or the spread of the virus responds. So I think what we have done over the years is to ensure that at no point are we overwhelmed by the pandemic, as we have seen in other countries. For that, so that's the trade-off that we have had, unfortunately, to take over these years. And the evidence in front of us right now shows us that government has been even-handed in terms of how it manages the lockdowns themselves, and the response has been that it's been effective.
Right. We are talking, of course, of a new variant now. I'm not talking what is happening right now, but I'm talking what was happening earlier on in the year. There are people who, for example, are saying it's irrational that we are not allowed to travel at midnight. What impact does that have, right? It's not as if the virus doesn't travel at midnight, it goes to sleep. You know, if it is there, yes, it is there, but what's the point of having people then not being allowed to move after 12 midnight?
You'll see that throughout these levels and these stages, what we try to do is to, yes, limit activity, but also at the same time allow as much activity as is necessary or as it is essential, right? So what we've found out in the research that we've done is that limiting the movement, especially at those times where people are maybe not so careful in terms of how they interact and the activities that go along with that time of the night, they've shown that more than just people not observing those non-pharmaceutical measures, there's also a lot of activities that also increase the number of casualties that we see in our hospital. And you'll remember that from the onset, we've said that the virus, yes, it is there, but what we fear the most is if we get to a point where we are unable to help as many people as possible to survive the virus when they do get infection. That's what we are trying to limit. So that's why these other measures that may seem that they are irrational, if you look at them individually, but looking at them holistically, this is how we are advised even by the WHO in terms of how do we lock down and how do we open up the country when the virus becomes under control.
Well, one would say, for example, in the 24 months, things, for example, like the special grant, right, should now have already been legislated in the social development department, so that, because part of the reasons why you're able to extend that social safety net is because we're in a state of national disaster. But it's not something that should continue into perpetuity, especially if we are going to at some point reach a point where the COVID-19 virus is endemic, and in other words, it lives with us. We're going to have to find a way of bringing those laws in to be able to work within a normal setting, not under a state of national disaster. Why has it not been something that the departments have been pursuing?
Unfortunately, this is something that the departments, or in fact the whole of government, is looking into. It's been looking into this for, I think now, well over 12 months, whether we can use alternative forms of legislation in order to manage this type of a disaster. And we've looked at the National Health Act in terms of how it can help us to control the spread of the virus, while also implementing some of these non-pharmaceutical measures. But we haven't got to that point yet. And the fortunate thing, though, for us is that we are now at level 1, and we've been at level 1 for a long time. And if we look at what happened, for example, with the Spanish flu, and we hope that this will be consistent with this one, is that at this stage, this is a stage where we are actually getting to a point where we are, the virus itself starts to dissipate, and its impact on society reduces. And then as soon as we get to that point, we will be able to exit the state of disaster. So government is not blind to that. It's aware that we can't have the state of disaster forever, but it needs to be careful in terms of how we exit the country out of it.
Lungi Mtshali, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming through and bringing that clarity to us. Speaking on behalf of the Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs Department.